This is how I transformed a student's grade from a D to an A using 3 steps in just 20 minutes a week, and how I've helped hundreds of students get an A or an A star in A-level biology and get into medical school over 15 years of being a teacher and an examiner. Now, 99% of students are doing exam questions wrong, and it's probably the reason why you're not getting the A's and the A stars. But there is a 3-step framework that I use and that the best students and examiners use to improve those grades from E's and U's up to A's and A stars. Now, normally teachers sell this as a masterclass, but I'm giving this away completely for free because I'm on a mission to help 10,000 students get an A or an A star in A-level biology. Now, these are the 3 steps you need to learn if you want to get those grades. So number 1 is you need to learn actually how to use a mark scheme. Then number 2, you need to learn how to correct your exam paper. And then that leads to number 3, which is how you actually improve and how you actually get that better grade. So I'm going to talk you through, first of all, how to use a mark scheme. So we have to understand all the codings. They are very important. And I have so many conversations with students where they're like, wait, why didn't I get that mark there? This is why. And as an examiner, it's taken me years of developing my knowledge on this to really understand how this works. And I'm going to save you those thousands of hours and teach you it right now. Now, the first point is a slash. And a slash is a really simple one. It just means you can say anything between the slashes. So for this first marking point, you could have said thylakoid, either grana or granum. And then the next point brings us to these ticks. So a tick, each line for OCRA is a marking point. Therefore, you couldn't say thylakoid, grana and granum to get 3 marks. You could only do that to get 1. And you can mix and match these with your answers in the mark scheme. So for instance, you could say the thylakoid provides a large surface area for ATP synthase, or you could say the granum increases surface area for light absorption or for photosynthesis. And you'll notice in there's a little comma just here, and every time there is a comma, you need to have everything between the commas, and there's one just there I scribbled over. So you have to have some phrase here that says surface area. So if you just said a thylakoid increased for light absorption, well, you'd get 1 more mark for thylakoid, but you wouldn't be credited this mark. Next, we're going to look at do not allow and allow. Now, this word allow, and this is from the chief examiner, means it isn't as good as we had liked. So we don't mind if you have written values in the table, but it must be in standard form. But we would have preferred you to give the answer like this, and in this question I'm assuming was on the answer line. Okay, if it says do not allow, however, you're not allowed to do that thing. So it appears this question was asked to be to either 3 significant figures or 1 decimal place. So if you've given the probably full answer, that is then incorrect because you've not given it to 1 decimal place. So the 5, even though you've correctly not rounded, you've given the correct answer, the question specifically wanted to 1 decimal place, and an A-level biology that has context in terms of accuracy. The next one, however, is ignore. Now, ignore means we are pretending it's not even on the page. So if we see it, we're not going to mark it as correct or incorrect. We pretend that it's not even there. So for instance, in this question, describe the bond, which is what we're interested in, between 2 glucose monomers in maltose. So that's a 1,4 glycosidic bond. Now, if you just started talking about some other carbohydrates, we're just going to ignore it. Even if it's an incorrect one, if you start talking about sucrose, which is another disaccharide, so a double sugar, we're just going to ignore it, which is different to do not allow. So you just pretend it's not on the page. When we have an underline, however, you must have that exact section or whole part of a question. So for instance here, you have to get GLY. Now most of the time, you're allowed phonetic spelling, and really it comes down to the exam year whether you're allowed to mix up the spelling of an underline, because sometimes you are allowed. So for instance, I've seen people accept water spelt with an R underlined. Water spelt like this would be correct. It's a very rare mistake that we see, but it would be generally allowed. But obviously you want to try and do the spelling your best you can. The idea is if the word could be another word, it's not accepted. It's clear from this spelling water means water, okay? But glyco, and if I was to perhaps change that to a C or another letter, that would probably change. There's lots of G words in biology that would change the meaning of the word. The next one is error carried forward. What this means is if you make a mistake earlier in the question, you're not going to be punished again later in the question. So for instance, if you got the glycosidic section wrong, if you called it say a peptide bond, which is in proteins, but you called it a 1,4 peptide bond, you would lose the glycosidic mark, but you would still get the carbon 1 to carbon 4. Now AW stands for alternate wording. What that generally means is this phrase could be written in a few different ways. Therefore, they will allow it written in a different way. Now, it doesn't happen that often. Normally, they're pretty good in exams now. They provide lots of slashes for the examiners. They even have conversations with the chief examiners to find out the kinds of things students say. They also go through a variety of rounds of marking where new mark schemes come out until they get to the final one. So it doesn't tend to happen so much, but that's what it means. Now, or reverse argument essentially means if you say one thing goes up but the other one goes down, you could say it the other way around. You could say one thing goes down but the other thing goes up. So for instance, in this question, we're saying that endosymbiosis theory suggests that mitochondria may have evolved from bacteria that were taken inside of other cells. So for instance, here you could say only eukaryotic cells would respire aerobically that have the mitochondria, or you could say it the other way around. You could say the cells that don't have the mitochondria could not respire aerobically and then would have a less of a survival advantage. So you can say it either way round. Now, if I could teach you one thing, it would be how to level. So with the 6 markers, students generally think you say 6 marks, you say 6 things, but that's not how it works. Even at GCSE, especially at A level. What we have to be good at is understanding that we're answering the whole question, and to get in that higher level, you have to answer all aspects of the question. So if you look here, this question is saying compare, which means similarities and differences between plant and animal species that make up a climax and a pioneer community. Okay, that means if you don't talk about both plants and animals and the climax and the pioneer community, you will only be put in one of the lower levels. So for instance, here you can see with the leveling to get into the level 3 and therefore 5 or 6 marks. Now the decision between the two, normally it's examiner's guidance on that. So it might be, for instance, they need 2 of climax and 1 pioneer or something like that. And every year it's a bit niche. Don't worry about it too much as a student. You just want to give the best answer you can. Use as many keywords as you can and you'll likely get that higher mark of the 2. However, it's much easier to get that mark in the lower level, so it's easier to get a 2 than it is in theory to get a 6. In terms of going from the 1 up to the 2 is easier than to go from the 5 to the 6. Now in this example you can see, just like the wording of the mark scheme, have you made a comparison between plant and animal, so plant and animal, and that's highlighted to the examiner, in climax and the pioneer community. So if you don't do, even if you did a brilliant job and you gave me 6 things about plants, 6 things about animals, all involved in the climax community, if you've not mentioned pioneer, you are stuck. And even, and this is why this is so important, even to get out of the 1 and 2 mark category, you still need to talk about both plants, animals, climax and pioneer community. Now you might be sitting here thinking, oh my god, how do I know to do that? In another video, I'll teach you exactly how to break down exam questions. The good news is the exam board word the questions really well, and once you know the technique, it makes these marks so much easier to get. Now, another example of that is this question here, where you're asked to evaluate, that means for and against, and discuss validity, a firm's claim using evidence. So, for instance, for leveling this question, you need to give evidence for, because that's what an evaluation is, evidence against, and you need to have discussions on validity. You had to give in support, for, against, and validity. All of that is required to get you into the top level. So without that discussion on all of those things which you'll learn in A-level biology, you won't be able to get in the top marking bracket. So now you know exactly how our mark scheme works. In other videos I go into much more detail on this, but you've got an overall summary. Now you've done that, you know how to mark yourself, you know how to do that correctly. Now we're going to do an exam paper correctly, and I'm going to show you an example of how to do that. So here are my 5 steps on how to do an exam paper. Do them exactly. So first of all, do them in exam conditions. Yeah, if you're with a friend and you're doing some work with a friend, fine. But if you want to improve, have exam conditions. Sit next to your friend, both of you sit in silence, put your earpods in and sit in silence and do the question. Now do one entire question at a time. So 1A, 1B, 1C, II, etc. Do all of that, then stop and mark it. By doing that, you'll have a better understanding of what's in the question and you'll apply the mark scheme better. Then mark it, as we've just shown you before. Now step 3 is annotate and write out your mistakes, which most people tell you to do. Schools will do things like use a purple pen. Fine, go for that. Now the important thing I want you to do is this exact question asked this thing that you wrote down. Good job for getting it right. But a very similar question in the future might ask a bit of different information, and you need to know that as well. So write the extra information that you didn't think of. That is more important than just ticking it correct. It's writing down the extra information you didn't think, as well as the things that you missed. Then what I suggest you do is just take those things only and revise those. Everything you've got, leave as a general rule. Anything you could have added more, revise that however you would do, and again in another video I'll show you how to do that. Now here's a really good example of a student that I was working with. This is a GCSE student working at a grade 5, and within 2 or 3 lessons of teaching this technique, and cheat code here is GCSE this works as well. They went up to a grade 9 and they've been working persistently at a grade 9 for a while now with just a few lessons of teaching exam technique. So this is an example of their answers where they did pretty well, but they were adding information, they were annotating what could they have done more, what could they have written more. And a final golden nugget of information here is, however many marks the question is asking for, so let's just say this question here is asking for 1, say 2 things. Yeah, they got that 1 mark, but they might not have got that mark in the future if the mark scheme was specifically slightly another way. This is why we learn all of the things associated with the question. We say it all every time, and the examiner just gets to ignore the stuff that's not quite there and go for the things that are. Again, another example here where a student has gone from a grade 5 up to a grade 8, another GCSE example, it works with A levels well, in just 3 weeks of practice. And in my next video, I'm going to show you exactly how to structure answers.